Let me start this video off with a few things. First, if you think your deck should be higher on the tier list, I need some sort of proof. I get 4 million comments about how your deck should be better because you've got this secret strategy that makes Gate Guardian meta. If that's the case, you can join my Discord, show me your deck, tournament results, or some replays. If you can't do that and your deck has nothing else going for it, your deck's relevancy is a lot like a Mystic Mind player's friends. It doesn't exist. Second, I've made a website where I'm going to try to keep an updated list of the tier list. Also, if you click on any highlighted deck, it'll take you to a deck profile for it if I've done one. Also, I'll have a page with all of my deck lists that I've shown in these videos that you can download. The website's also going to have articles and guides for every card game I cover, including Yu-Gi-Oh! And Vanguard. Now, on to the tier list. Let's get into some decks I missed, because there are just too many decks, and no source has a good, complete list of them. Fair warning, I did miss quite a few this time. Benkei is a super dated OTK deck that's all about spamming equips on the card Armed Samurai Benkei for quick OTK. Surprisingly, this deck has gotten infinitely more consistent thanks to the Fire Warrior engine and Isolde. Still, this deck has massive consistency issues and loses to any removal. Here's a list I found showing the basic gimmick. Cyberdark have kind of merged with Cyber Dragon. I will say, there's no reason not to just take out the Cyber cards and just play a more pure Cyber Dragon deck. But let's say you want to be a meme lord and focus on a Cyberdark strategy, well, it actually does work somehow. It's not good, but it can set up for pretty good combos. Cyberdark Chimera is a power bond searcher, the Cyberdark spells search Cyber Dragon spells, and if you can make it to the 5 material boss monster, or its specific 3 material boss monster, its new support lets it become a big tower's beat stick. This deck is held up to the casual tier by its synergy with Cyber Dragon, although Cyber Dragon can be infinitely better with only 1 or 2 Cyberdark cards as a tech to aid Cyber Dragon combos. Yugioh are kind of like a more focused gadget deck. You've got the searching and extra summoning, but only some of the engine is what you're looking for. This deck is barely modernized by generic train support, which gives them the ability to do something threatening with a rank 4. It's a very hard deck to comment on, in all honesty. You make 1 or 2 rank 4s and up the setup for a negate and OTK. Here's a pretty fun list combining them with Machina. This deck has a fair bit of potential as a machine spam engine, but it's still too slow to get higher on the list. Felgrand is a weird, small, level 8 dragon deck, very similar to Blue Eyes. In fact, if the main deck monsters said Blue Eyes instead of Felgrand, it wouldn't feel that out of place. What this deck does is equip dragon monsters to its 2 main deck warrior monsters. Well, its main dragon... Oh god, I regret to inform you. Felgrand Dragon is dead. Tried to play against Eldritch and just couldn't do it anymore. Why? But more seriously, Felgrands are a dated graveyard setup engine for dragon decks. They have a fantastic rating boss monster, and Felgrands do work with Blue Eyes, Dragoonity, or generic Dragon Link support, but it doesn't help any of these decks more than they already work on their own. Demise is a very simple ritual deck. The goal is to summon one of its 2 variants of ritual monsters. The king side is all about board removal, and the queen side is all about extra attacks. Neither side gets you disruption during your opponent's turn, however. Both of the sides do get your ritual monsters some protection, although it's not quite enough to let the deck go second, like the ritual monsters imply the deck wants to. But the deck is consistent thanks to all the generic ritual support, and also this deck has a ritual spell that can ritual summon the monsters right out of the deck. And being able to do that to summon a board wipe counts for something, right? Here's a list I made that's trying to go second. It's a bit dated and struggles to play if the ritual monster gets negated, but it's a surprisingly solid deck. I'll place this deck at a low casual tier, as it's a go second deck that's just not equipped for the modern game. Nephthys are too hard to spell and are a destruction ritual link deck that unfortunately just negs too hard and don't make enough real interaction that's needed to be higher on the tier list. Also, the deck's main boss monster is a very awful towers monster that takes 3 ritual monsters to make and loses to a non-targeting removal effect. But this deck does have a few very strong things going for it. First, this deck has a link monster that's just a +2. Its ritual monsters summon cards right out of the deck, and the Nephthys monsters float very well. Also, the main engine is pretty light, so you can tech in other engines to fix some of the deck's problems. Here's my list for Nephthys. I'm running 12 hand traps, and I'm using Hopcar Squadron for synchro plays and Divinal of Herald, both for synchro plays and for a search. The legendary Fisherman, or Umi, is a weird water synergy deck, with half of its support being OCG only. The deck has 2 things going for it. First, the legendary Fisherman Mark III is a fairly solid towers monster, being unaffected by towers effects and immune to destruction by card effects. Fisherman Mark III also banishes all your opponent's cards and summons. Fisherman Mark II is immune to all the monster effects as long as Umi is on the field. Second, the deck has excellent synergy with all generic water support, be it Sharks, the Water Barrier Statue, Kairu Shin, or even Bahamut Shark. This of course is where the strategy gets its strength from. Here's a list I made showing off all the water synergy. I was able to fit in 8 hand traps, although you could fit in more. I'm putting this deck near the bottom of casual for its consistency issues. Battering Min is a very simple and effective thunder spam engine. It's got simple synergy with archetypes like Hunter and Thunder Dragon, and this engine can chain together normal summons and can pull cards right out of the deck. The downside is that the best effects are locked on to level 5 or higher monsters. I originally thought this deck was tier 5, but that was because I had confused this deck with Morphtronics. I apologize. A Morphage are a powerful series of floodgate cards with an unfortunately heavy cost. Well, at its best, the deck can simply lock out an opponent's everything with a simple pendulum summon, but very quickly, problems start to appear. There's no real way to set up your Morphage cards, and there's no way to search them outside of Odd-Eye's Revolution Dragon. See, in order to set up your locks, you need at least 3 Morphage cards on the field, and you practically have to hard draw them. And looking at all that, you can just run a Mystic Mine or the Adventure Engine instead. And I said all of this without mentioning the fact that at the start of every turn, the Pendulum monsters require you to tribute a monster for each card in the Pendulum Zone or destroy the Pendulum Zones. I'm putting this deck right before Gradles. It's like a stun variant version of those Glass Cannon Wombo combo decks. It has like the exact same issues of consistency and recovery. Flower Guardian are a semi-luck based Wombo combo deck. They're incredibly confusing and somewhat bricky, but they have way more than at first glance going for them. Guardian monsters don't have hard ones for turn effects, letting their combos go on for a while. This deck's spell lineup is genuinely fantastic, letting you solve every problem the deck has, be it either starters or extenders. This deck's inboard is surprisingly good. Guardian Boardfly turns off in-grave effects and special summons from the grave even after he leaves the field. Guardian Light Shower is a spell and trap negate that can float into another Guardian Synchro monster. Also, this deck has solid removal options. Now, more on the bad. This deck is hard locked in the Flower Guardians, meaning you can't truly abuse the power that this deck should output. How well this deck plays through hand traps is kind of determined by how lucky you are. You can pretty easily play through 2 negates, except for Nibiru, as that just is going to end your existence. Here's my list. It's a combo build. The goal is to make a board fly and then make 2 light flare. Also, Guardian Light Shower is really strong playing in the time. You can very easily make 3 of them to burn your opponent for 4,500 damage on their turn. Fire King is a self-destruction control deck whose self-destruction theme has gotten stronger and more consistent over time, although that doesn't exactly excuse the deck's lack of interaction and overall slow strategy. Basically, the deck pluses for destroying its own cards and get a board wipe on standby phase, plus a monster negate that triggers a destruction. These cards do always keep reviving themselves for constant value, but in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It's just not fast enough, and it can be very hard to go second. The good news is there's a few archetypes and generic support cards that this deck works exceptionally well with, such as Cosmos, True Kings, and Nephthys. These decks give the deck something more to do going first, and synergize amazingly with the Fire King strategy, not to mention cards like Nine-Tailed Fox, who can generate 2 tokens for extra value. Here's my list for Nephthys, True Draco, Fire Kings. It's pretty solid, although this deck is definitely very dated. Magnet Warriors are an anime rock combo deck that's about spamming out little guys, and thanks to the Adamantipator engine, these guys can spam out a lot of monsters. Because all the Magnet Warriors get an effect when they're summoned, each time an Adamantipator hits one, they get their effect, which can be anything from a special summon to a dump one from deck. Since they're level 3 Earth Rock monsters, they give you access to Gorgonic Guardian and Naturia Beast. Thanks to the 2 Magnet Warriors, these cards can reload if their board gets wiped. What keeps this deck out of a higher casual tier is that it struggles to play through hand traps, like at all, unless it can see multiple Adamantipator engine pieces or Magnet Induction. This deck is very consistent, as the Magnet engine is surprisingly very solid. Here's my list for the deck. If someone could cut a few of the Magnet cards, I think we could make this list a bit more resistant to hand traps with Cross-Link Designator, Called by the Grave, but I'm not sure what Magnet we could cut without dramatically affecting the list consistency. Welcome to Tier 5. This is where decks start to get really good. We see some consistent, strong inboards, powerful removal options, and the ability to play through some hand traps consistently. First off, we have Aromage, which is barely able to escape the casual tier. Aromage becomes the best plant deck by being able to make the most out of all the plant support, at least until the new Rika support hits the TCG. Aromage has searchable trap disruptions and some very solid draw power. What if I told you that thanks to the Sun Avalon engine, it has access to a 2-card Cactus Bouncer lock that any Sun Avalon starter and an Aromage life point gain, or an instant fusion or ready fusion equals a Cactus Bouncer. Cactus Bouncer is a card that has to be normal summon that locks both players out of special summoning. Dried Winds is also an easily searchable disruption. Builds with this deck can synchro spam, easily do generic Auroradon combos, or play more stun oriented. Here's my build that's all about putting Cactus Bouncer on the field from anywhere in the deck. Basically, it works by Aromas Fairy, Jasmine searching any plant monster, and Aromage Jasmine giving the extra normal summon. This is solid, but I believe other builds are better. I just like my list. Aromages as a whole tend to be fairly consistent, and they can play around hand traps depending on the build. Dino Wrestler at first might seem like a really incomprehensible joke of a deck, but they do have a lot going for them. First is the generic Dino support working amazingly well with Dino Wrestlers. Second, the field spell being able to summon out Dino Wrestler cards from the deck going second. And third, the good Dino Wrestlers actually do a good job of extending each other into more monsters. The biggest downside of this deck is the fact that it is a hard go second deck, and its best card, Dino Wrestler Prankeratops, is limited to 1 because of how generically good it is at going second. Here's my list for Dino Wrestlers. This list is all about having Dino Wrestler engine run parallel to generic Dino support. If we can put a World Dino Wrestling Engrave going second, we can 1-card combo our Dino Wrestler plays and set up for an OTK. Just draw Dark Rulers no more, or Forbidden Droplets, and you'll be fine. Nemesis are a banished synergy deck with a boss monster that turns off summoning of a type of monster. This deck used to have 2 monsters that did that. Thanks to Sword Souls, one of them got banned. Every low-level Nemesis just shuffles back a banished card into the deck to summon itself. They also have effects on field to search out other Nemesis cards or add back cards from the banished zone. There's not really a lot to the archetype, but everything they have is pretty good. Here's a Nemesis deck using Chaos Lightsworn and give a good variety of types to choose from for their boss monsters effect. Crystal Beasts are a cool combo deck locked behind a relatively hard to get to condition. Crystal Beasts have to place their monsters into the spell and trap zones to activate all their good effects. The good news is, once you get there, the deck can do a lot of cool stuff, including special summoning out of the deck, drawing 2 cards with their own Pot of Greed, and special summoning a lot of monsters out of the spell and trap zones. Crystal Bond and Rainbow Bridge are both 1-card setups to the condition, but Ash Blossom exists, so it can be rough. One thing this deck can do regardless of the requirement is make Rainbow Neos, which is pretty strong, although not game-winning in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Libromancers are an extremely small ritual engine that have a surprisingly powerful punch. They are the middle child of generic ritual engines. Basically, Libromancer Geek Boy is a 1-card combo for the entire deck. Libromancers then can either be used as a free link 2 for Cross Shape and Omni Negate, or they can leave out a level full water monster, leaving possible shenanigans open. The only cost is revealing a ritual monster in hand, so it's pretty free. That's about all the deck does, but it works very well, and if it gets more support, it has an insane amount of potential. Here's my list pairing this deck with Necros to set up for some pretty cool combos. Ice Barriers a few years ago should have never been this high, but the new wave of support this deck has gotten has made this deck, how do I put this, totally awesome to play. Ice Bears are now able to spam out a lot of water monsters. Typically, this means making a lot of totally awesomes, but the classic array of Ice Bear Synchro monsters is still available, to help go second. Now, a really big part of understanding why Ice Barriers are so high is knowing about the Ice Barrier shit list. You see, Ice Barriers have a weird variety of super niche but incredibly powerful effects in the right situations. Revealer of the Ice Barrier blocks tribute summoning, so it can just stop Monarchs and True Dracos from existing. Speaker for the Ice Barrier stops battle position changing, so if you roll up the table 500 expecting to win with your digital bugs, you done fucked up, buddy. General Wayne of the Ice Barrier banishes all spells and traps sent from field to graveyard. This just destroys graveyard-reliant decks like Sky Striker. Lastly, Spellbreaker of the Ice Barrier stops our opponent from activating spell cards for a turn. I suppose I should have just started with this one, but you get how powerful this can be in the right matchup. If Ice Barriers were a bit less resource-intensive, they could be a rogue deck in future. The new support really does have a lot of potential. Gustos are a Wind Synchro self-destruction floating deck that I've accidentally aged into being decent. What used to be one of the hardest to use cards in the archetype, Gusto Griffin, has become one of the dumbest combo enablers. Gusto Griffin, when he's sent from hand to graveyard, lets you special summon a Gusto monster right out of the deck. With new cards like Wind the Wind Charmer, Dragonic Diagram, and the new Tailwind of Gusto, his carding is very easy. Gustos outside of that have a very funny reverse OTK with the card Digusto Spirez, makes your opponent take battle damage from any time you would take battle damage. And since the Gustos all float on destruction, you can easily OTK if your opponent's monster has high enough attack. Gustos are also able to steal just about every other generic Wind deck support and abuse those. With Baron de Fleur, this deck gets a new boss monster. Here's my list. I'm running it with Speedroids and Marianne the True Draco Phoenix as enablers. Windmitch also work very well with this deck, although I prefer the options my chosen engines provide. Generic Wind Spam is a deck that's on my list for eventually hitting critical mass with future support. All the engines that exist right now are pretty good and don't conflict with each other. It's just missing the right boss monsters and extenders. Baron de Fleur got us a lot closer to this. S-Force are a weird banished monster spam deck with a column gimmick. Luckily, they have quite a few ways to summon their monsters directly out of deck and can link summon using S-Force retroactive in hand. S-Force are able to set up a monster negate and a bounce to without losing a lot of resources in hand. Honestly, there's not a lot to say about S-Force. You set up your Link 3, go for a banish setup, and you hand trap your opponent to death. They're fine deck, but they need something forceful to be relevant. Here's my list for S-Force. It's very basic, but it gets the job done. Aliens and Reptilian are our next 2 interconnected decks. While they are both technically separate archetypes with different strategies, They use so much of the same support, it's crazy. First off, Abyss is one of the most insane ways to set up for alien combos. One Stake Rain, you have full setup for your alien combos, and you have the full Abyss combo line for extra board pressure. Alien's got one of the best boss monsters in Cosmic Slice of Zero. Zero immediately gives access to a double monster negate on a summon, as well as being able to extend into other alien cards. Alien Overlord is a fantastic extender, and all of the new alien cards have engrave effects to add some recovery to the deck. Aliens also have access to a triple until the end of turn Widow Anchor if you like memes. The card is called Mass Hypnosis, and it's just peak comedy. Reptilian are a weird deck that's all about setting your opponent's monsters attack to 0 for value and disruption. Luckily, this deck has come a long way from its initial release. It has some truly insane cards. First off, they have a spell card that is a Search 2. It searches one Reptilian monster and a Reptilian spell. Reptilian Spawn is a spell card that makes 2 tokens with no restrictions afterward. And the Reptilian Field Spell lets us take control of our opponent's monsters on their turn when combined with Reptilian's Synchro monster. Reptilian's Link monster lets us search reptile cards from our deck equal to the number of cards our opponent controls with 0 attack. Best part is, all these cards are generic reptile support cards, so they work with Abyss and Alien. Putting all this together, we have this deck here, also known as Reptile Much. The Reptilian engine is free setup for alien boss monsters, while alien main deck monsters are free extenders and recovery, all while the Abyss engine goes ham. Now, this deck is crazy fun to play, but fair warning, it's very hard to pilot. Also, both Reptilian and aliens can run a lot of hand traps, and the adventure engine if you cut out an engine or 2. So it's very solid. Arcana Knights are an anime archetype that's gotten a lot of solid support. Hold on. Apparently the canon name of this archetype is the Three Musketeers of face cards. That's so extra. They're able to easily swarm the field and pull off an OTK with Joker straight. Their Thunderboard Summon lets the deck search the Winged Beast Dragon of Raw Spear mode from deck and summon it during the opponent's turn. Or you can just make a Slifer the Sky Dragon and disrupt the opponent's monsters. The deck can also abuse generic warrior and normal monster support to help play through hand traps. The deck does have some issues playing into negates, but a solid list can do a lot to minimize this problem. Here's my perfectly normal list for Arcana Knights. Once this deck gets its new wave of janky OCG support, it'll have access to stupid bricky combos and a fun board wipe. Infernity are a crazy not once per turn wombo combo deck, but despite its potential has been left in a poor state due to hand traps. Infernity is all about setting up a loop with Infernity Necromancer and immediately filling up the board with links and synchros. The cost is having specific cards on field and grave, as well as not having cards in hand. These costs are surprisingly doable, but the real challenge is playing through hand traps. Luckily, Infernity Wildcat and Infernity Paranoia help with this somewhat as extenders. This is a list I found for Infernity. It's not the optimal way to play the deck, but its gimmick of just sending your entire hand to the graveyard immediately made me laugh, so I'm showing it. Blue Eyes White Dragon is the classic anime deck that's all about summoning out big dragons. Blue Eyes are kind of stuck in 2016. They get new support every other month, but none of it's overwhelming. Blue Eyes also don't benefit as much from generic Dragon Link support when compared to decks like Dragoonity. Blue Eyes have a lot going for them though. Blue Eyes Alternative Dragon is still a great starter. Nebula Dragon is crazy for the deck, letting you instantly go into number 97, Dragubelon, and Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon is still crazy strong against a select few decks. Of course, Blue Eyes is still very good at OTKing. Blue Eyes are also still very bricky, and most builds can't fit in a lot of hand traps, kneecapping this deck's viability. Even if you can search Effect Veiler. I refuse to show a deck list for this, out of principle. Fire Fist are a continuous spell wombo combo deck that has overall great disruption, but lacks good enough extenders to really keep it going into higher tiers. They've got a fusion monster that can quick effect pop one, and a ritual monster that's a quick effect monster negate, and they have an easily searchable counter trap, spell, and trap negate. This deck would be a lot higher in tier 5 if Fire Formation Tenki wasn't limited. Thanks, Tri Brigade. The deck is extremely normal summon dependent, so it can't work with the adventure engine, but it can work with Tri Brigades even if it's not a perfect match. The deck fits a low number of hand traps, but makes up for it with its explosive combos. Here's my list for Fire Fist. It's a pure build, so it's a bit inconsistent when compared to other builds, but you do get access to the entire extra deck, and I think that's fun. X-Sabers are a surprisingly powerful special summon spam synchro deck. Their 2 main monsters are Fault Roll and Bogart, who can very quickly spam out a board. Rescue Cat is also very good in this deck. The deck has easy access to Notoria Beast, and the deck's boss monster, XX-Sabers Gothams, can loop cards out of the opponent's hands. This deck can play the Tri-Brigade engine and immediately jump to a tier 5 deck. The only real problem with this deck is its vulnerability to hand traps and the difficulty to get plays started. However, thanks to the Tri-Brigade engine, you can bait out hand traps and get a free extra summon. Also, you can run the adventure engine. Here's a list I found that's a little dated, but it cleans up very well. Dark Worlds change out the crazy wombo combo potential of Fabled for more removal effects and more generic effects, letting this deck work extremely well with dangers. Now, it's at this point in the script that I'm going to get mad at people who say this isn't a deck tier list and is instead an archetype tier list. The best Dark World builds make use of dangers, ranking this deck as Dark World and dangers. I do consider hybrid decks for every deck on the tier list, and I am ranking the strategies, not archetypes. It's just that most decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are kind of archetypes. For those of you who do want hybrid decks to be visualized in the tier list, it's just impossible because the number of unique hybrid decks that are viable would number in the thousands. But back to Danger Dark World. What makes Danger Dark World stand out is their ability to take and abuse other engines. Because this deck can always put out 4 generic monsters, some crazy stuff can happen. Builds can run the 5-card Phantom Knight engine, they can make use of Fairy Tail Snow, and can make use of the rank 8 extra deck. This deck can play through negates very well, but anything more than 2 negates can start to be a bit of a problem. The biggest downside to this deck is how it struggles to run hand traps. Here's my list. It's a bit rough, but it's pretty solid. Skull Servants are a tumor on every zombie build or graveyard deck in the game. It does not matter what archetype comes out, some idiot is going to put in Skull Servants, and because of how self-milling the archetype is, it's just going to work as a janky OTK strategy. I'll just be playing Lightsworn, and I'll mill a white baking out of nowhere and just go full combo. I don't even run Skull Servants. So King of Skull Servants gets 1k attack for every Skull Servant in grave, and it's extremely easy to put Skull Servants in grave with our tools. When White Banking is sent to the graveyard, he searches 2 Skull Servant cards. White Mare lets us revive one or loop 1 banished Skull Servant. White Prince lets us dump 2 Skull Servants from the deck, then banish them to summon out a King of Skull Servants. Also, all of these count as Skull Servants in grave. Personally, I'd recommend playing this deck with a combination of Eldritch and the Adventurer engine. The Weather are ranked high on this tier list for 2 reasons. 1, how well they play around hand traps, and 2, how well they can abuse generic toxic control cards, be it Skill Drain, Dimensional Shifter, or just a lot of hand traps. These all have a home in the deck because of how the entire deck banishes and then searches itself to get value. If you ash them, it only stops the search and the monsters will come back. The deck just struggles against 2 things: spell and trap removal and big monster effects. Here's a list I've made. It's extremely toxic, and honestly, the biggest issue with Weathers before their next wave of support is that they're just kind of boring. Despots are a synchro spam OTK deck that has some of the best access to Auroradon combos and can abuse generic machine support like Urgent Schedule and Machine Dupe. Despot 01 and Despot 03 are fantastic combo cards, but what really makes this deck stand out is its ability to still run 9 hand traps and being able to OTK through disruption. Also, because this is a pendulum deck, there's options for recursion and for a grind game. Here's my list for combo deck bots. It's very standard but very effective. Get a starter to stick and you go full combo. Your starters are a Despot 03, a Despot 02 pendulum summon, or Despot 02 and a machine dupe. Or you know what? You could just go Urgent Schedule. Soulful Chord are a weird pendulum control combo deck and the world's worst opera singers. Luckily, the deck is extremely flexible and can make use of all the random pendulum support in the game. This deck can use Diviner of Herald as a 1-card starter and can search some disruption. Specifically, this deck's main trap card can pop one or it could summon one from your extra deck. All this taking into account, you can make IP Masquerena plays very easy. The big downside of this deck, outside of its weird combos, is how vulnerable it can be to hand traps. Here's a list I found from Binks on YouTube. He's got a pretty good breakdown for the deck. Rock Stun is a very dated yet effective toxic stun strategy. Yet another degenerate game plan boosted by Mystic Mine. Although, this deck doesn't need to use it. Rock is all about sitting on toxic Rock Stun cards like Fossil Dino, Pack and Celifo. You know, we're just gonna call him Fossil Dino. Or Barrier Statue of the Drought and the Quacky Meru Boys. This deck is able to abuse cards like Tides of the Brethren for some hard to out boards. Locking out the opponent of special summoning, then adding an additional negates is the goal. Here's my list for modernized Rock Stun. This deck is going to be quite toxic, but surprisingly effective. Gate Ruler and Crossout Designator are ran to stop people from just infinite and perming our Floodgate monster, and Moon Mirror Shield is a classic Floodgate meme. People forget this is still a reasonable stun deck because it kind of disappeared during Zodiac format. That being said, if you take this to my locals, we can't be friends. Monarchs are still the crazy domain lock Floodgate deck they've always been. They've gotten all their cards off the ban list, so they're looking very good. They've got synergy with cards like Majesty's Fiend and Vanity's Fiend, and they can just blow out your opponent if they're not prepared for it. However, the main downside of inconsistency still remains a noticeable problem, even with the newer support for the deck. Hand traps stop this deck's optimal tribute lineup from Idea. Although newer builds tech in cards such as Ink Morphorite or the ever classic Continent engine to play around hand traps, it's not great. Stormforth is still extremely powerful, as well as Monarch's Erupt is. Just be sure to go first or resolve a lucky Stormforth into Vanity's Fiend. Cleaforts are a toxic stun helmet deck that is as high as it is because skill drain is at 3. Unironically, skill drain lets the deck be a lot better than it should be. Cleaforts want their effects negated because their own effects are either when they're tributed or their effect decreases the level on attack. Skill drain makes this super toxic. Between Pot of Duality and Pot of Prosperity, this deck has a lot of chances to see skill drain. Cleaforts also have their own built-in lose one turn that also banishes level 5 or higher monsters, letting Cleaforts just destroy most Synchro and Fusion-based decks. Also, this deck does have the first Towers monster. It's nowhere near the good strategy it was back then, but Cleafort Towers can rip a card out of the opponent's hand. Here's my updated list from a deck profile I did a while back. This list is Cleafort Monarchs, and yes, it has aged very well. The principle is to abuse the fact that Cleafort stats match with Monarch stats, and like tributing to set up for extra disruptions. If you want to see more how it works, just check out the card in the top right. Evil Swarm are an anti-meta pick that usually don't have a good meta to fight against. Evil Swarm have some light soaring potential, and the boss monster stops all level 5 or higher monsters from being special summoned. And he searches the spell and trap as well. Needless to say, this deck has an insane boss monster, and if the deck did anything else, outside of making the singular boss monster, it would be at least Rogue. The boss monster can use its spell and trap search to give itself protection and can ignore cards like Dark Ruler no more. Now, I believe I've just described the entire archetype to you, so here's a deck list that combines the archetype with Dogmatica and destroys Phoenix Enforcer engine, and I think this list is very good. I've never really got why Evil Eye never caught on. They function extremely well as a discount invoked engine. In exchange for a normal summon, you can gain a free quick effect monster disruption, or a negate, a link 2 or 3, or a counter trap spell and trap negate. Well, obviously it's not as good as Invoked. It does have the unique advantage of synergizing with Fiend monsters. They have a generate 2 token spell card that has an in-graveyard effect protection. The only downside is that it locks you in the Fiends. Do you know what else are Fiends? Nightmares, Unchained, and Evil Twin. They also have their own built-in Cosmic Cyclone. Think of this deck as an invoked engine with more options, but less direct power. Here's a list I found embracing the toxic stun elements of Evil Eye, and here's another list I found showing off the combo potential this deck has with Unchained. Ice Shade are a water combo deck that's all about playing off your opponent's inability to read cards. This deck has some decent ways to spam out water monsters, and a boss monster that says opponents can only use their effects the turn they are summoned. This is both surprisingly good and bafflingly terrible. Outside of making the weird boss monster and summoning out Toad, this deck activates effects if our opponent would attempt to interact with our board. If they would destroy our cards, we'd get massive value. This is a fun little water engine that's a bit slow, but it's incredibly generic and has a lot of power behind it. By the way, the starter for the adventure engine is a water monster, so there's synergy here. Here's a go second list I've made. It's a bit all over the place, but it hits harder than it should. This deck actually becomes kind of impressive once it gets a continuous spell from the OCG that says an opponent's monster can't activate their effects the turn they're summoned. Harpies are an anime winged beast spam deck. They focus around spamming out their monsters quickly and setting up the card Harpy's Featherstorm for a turn-long monster negate Floodgate and Cyber Slash Harpy Lady for a bounce. This deck works extremely well with Tribegate or Lyrilusk, but what makes this deck work is how effectively it can play around hand traps in the right player's hand. Elegant Egotist ensures that you can start a combo every time. If Samorg was still legal, there's a solid case to put this deck in a weak rogue, but as it is now, its inboards are just a little too weak. Nordic is a weird OTK deck with a major identity crisis. It doesn't quite want to go first, despite having an easily searchable field negate, and it's not the best at going second, despite all of its boss monsters being geared around the battle phase. The good news is, this deck has access to a 2-card synchro summon because the Nordic Link monster is a Link 1. It summons monsters out of the deck and gives targeting protection. Despite its initially seeming high cost, thanks to cards like Hippo Carnival and Alvis of the Nordic Alphar, we can plus anyway. What really makes this deck strong casual isn't how strong the cards are, instead of how tight the engine is. To demonstrate this, here's my Nordic deck list. As you can see, we can fit a lot of generic cards. My list is running the Adventure Engine and Crossout Designator and Called by the Grave to stop hand traps. This deck would be ranked higher, but I'm going to be very clear about this. When the deck got its new wave of support, they fixed the main deck and then nothing to fix the awful Synchro monsters that the deck revolves around. Timaeus, or the Legendary Knights, are an incredibly weird one. On one hand, their support is not great, and the entire deck together is a bit scuffed, but each of the 3 individual fusion spell lineups are surprisingly functional, and what puts this deck to size Eye of Timaeus Dark Magician builds, which aren't bad and are genuinely very decent. They can use Branded Fusion while using the Dark Magician support. The Eye of Timaeus support synergizes with the deck to give it an OTK option, as well as more ways to easily make Red Eye's Dark Dragoons. But this isn't quite a Legendary Knight deck, is it? To make up for this, I'm splitting the decks into 2 categories. One for Eye of Timaeus builds, and one for a Legendary Knights focused build. The Legendary Knights fall in the tier 3 for having a lot of solid support, that none of which really works well with each other. It does have a win con that's okay, it's just a really good towers monster, and it also has easy access to goons. Honestly, it's most of what's holding this deck together. You do have to run a lot of bricks to make this deck work, and there's not a lot of room for hand traps, and instead the deck has to rely on generic traps that Fang of Krytus forces you to run for fusion summons. No, that's not me misspeaking. You have to fusion summon with trap cards. Why? Resonators are a very fun synchro spam deck. Resonators can use Hot Red Dragon Archfiend and Red Supernova Dragon to make crazy inboards. The deck used to be plagued by consistency problems with its starters and extenders. Thanks to Chaos Ruler, the Chaotic Magic Dragon, the deck can find Resonators and combo off more often. The ideal inboard for this deck is 2 Disruptions and 1 Negate, and that's not quite enough to play against the meta, and the deck can struggle against hand traps, especially powerhouse hand traps like Nibiru. Here's a list I found that is for Master Duel, but it shows off what the deck can do with some very, very solid ratios. Cyber Angels are a ritual value deck that have a lot of synergy with every big ritual engine. In Drytron, this deck is known for being able to search fairy monsters right out of the deck. In a pure build, that means we're being able to pull out cards like Archlord Christia, or any combo piece from the deck. The downside is, Cyber Angels don't have a lot of built-in disruption and need to pull in goals from other decks. They have a very solid OTK lineup with protection, but that's just not enough in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Typically, this deck gets mixed with anything from Heralds to Dogmatica to Drytron to keep them alive. You've got 50 different ways to set up for a ritual summon, so hand traps outside of Droll and Lockbird aren't going to be the biggest problem. Here are 2 lists for Cyber Angels. The first one is a standard list using Dogmatica to get some extra disruption and consistency. The second list is about using Transonic Bird to use the Cyber Angel's strong removal effects on the opponent's turn at quick effect speed. Gladiator Beast are a combo contact fusion combat deck that was definitely designed pre-hand traps. The good news is that the Link 2 can jumpstart you into your combos, and Tri-Brigades can make that for free. Bad news is, the deck is super vulnerable and kind of all over the place. The deck can make very strong inboards, and the Gladiator Beast boss monster is a monster negate. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the main gimmick of Gladiator Beast. Most of them tag out at the end of battle phase to summon another one from deck after they attack. May God help your opponent if this resolves. But I believe we've been over why battle phase effects aren't that good. Luckily, the deck isn't dependent on this, and can loop special summoning the great effect. Here's my list. It's a very basic summon spam deck, although I'm putting in the Adventure Engine instead of hand traps. Morphtronic are probably the best purely luck-based deck in the game. They operate in a similar manner to Sylvans, where they check the top cards of the deck, but unlike Sylvans, Morphtronics actually have extenders, and the number of cards they check is usually greater than Sylvans. You see, Morphtronics roll a dice to determine how many cards they check, and that averages out to 3.5. So you're usually in a better spot. Since Morphtronics are a machine synchro deck, they're also in a better position to abuse machine duplication and Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon. Thanks to both that and their main cards, Morphtronics are able to spam summon crazy boards. That is, if you're not unlucky and continually roll a 1 after 1 after 1. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of good Morphtronics, so there's only so much you can do to manipulate the deck's luck. If Morphtronics got one more good main deck monster, it's very likely they could be a valid rogue deck for those who aren't unlucky. Here's my list for Morphtronics. I'm using Gizmak Naganaki, the Sunrise Signaler, as another way to get to Morphtronic Self-On and start our combos. You can see that in this list I'm able to fit a very sizable hand trap package, as well as cross-out designators. The biggest issue with this deck is getting unlucky and then having to deal with hand traps at the same time. Yang Xings are a combo synchro deck that at first glance might not seem like they have a lot going for them. It's a self-destruction deck that's known for missing timing, and its best combo card, Denlong, is banned. Well, support for destroying your own cards is really catching up, and the synchro monsters that aren't banned are still really good. Lastly, some worm support has really let this deck take off. Sword Souls have been revolutionary for the Yang Xing strategy. Sword Souls work with generic worms, and if you have any synchro on board, giving Yang Xing an additional playstarter, or a free way to buy time to set up a combo. If you've seen the meta deck Sword Soul Tenyu, it operates on a similar logic. If you've seen the meta deck Sword Soul Tenyu, Yang Xing Sword Souls operates in a similar manner, albeit a bit slower. Yang Xing's also let a synchro on the opponent's turn, similar to how Crystron's do, but Sword Soul monsters or Yang Xing monsters are very good outside of that. Here's my list for Yang Xing. The most notable things about my list is the field spell Equal to Zone, which lets us pop a Yang Xing on its summon. It can also destroy our opponent's monsters. This deck could fit in 10 hand traps, but I'm running Called by the Grave and Cross-Out Designator instead. Blue Eyes Chaos Max is the gimmicky yet better version of Blue Eyes. It has one goal: make Chaos Max a big, untargetable, and undestructible 4K monster that does double piercing damage, and that's just so incredibly simple, and it just gets the job done. Kinda like how Grand Magi the Aiza decks work. Thanks to Forbidden Droplets and Nibiru, this deck gets a lot better at going second than when it came out. All of the generic ritual support keeps this deck consistent, and Mad Lads can play Creature Swap to one-shot people by attacking into an incantation monster you give them. Inzectors are a Wombo combo equipped deck that has gotten some crazy support in its new spell card, as well as with the new B-Troop and Battle Wasp cards. Inzectors make some insane link plays by juggling Inzector Dragonfly, who summons straight out of the deck, and Inzectors can do some crazy board wipes with Inzector Hornet. The downside of this deck is it's a bit fragile, and the difficulty of setup for Inzector combos hurts consistency somewhat. Luckily, this deck has gotten fantastic extenders and starters from the new insect support. Not only that, the deck can use a small Infernoble Knight engine as additional starters. Here's a list I found combining them with B-Troopers. If the deck was a bit less fragile and could run a few more hand traps, it could definitely be Rogue. Magistus are a spellcaster spam deck with a cool extra deck equip gimmick. What makes Magistus work is how generic and low cost the engine is. Magistus boss monsters can prevent the activation of monster effects for more than one type of extra deck monster. Tri-Magistus provides free special summons of any spellcaster monster, or it can summon all Magistus monsters in hand. The biggest issue with Magistus as a deck is they don't do a lot on their own, and they take up a lot of deck space to really get value from them. Most spellcaster decks that could play the Magistus engine either want a normal summon, or they want a lot of their own archetype cards in hand. Magistus can also get hand trap early, and it severely hurts their combo output. Here's a list I found combining Magistus with Exosisters. It's a really cool concept, and shows how unrestricted Magistus are. Mutants have gotten so much better after their original shaky release. Mutant Mutator is a free searchable extender and a 1-card monster negate. This means the mutants have a 1.5 or 2-card combo that makes a monster negate and a spell negate while being resistant to hand traps. Mutants can do a lot more than just that. This deck has an easy trigger of Necrophase, is one of the best cards for removing your opponent's combo pieces, And with Emergency Teleport at 3, mutants have one of the best starters and extenders. This is because Emergency Teleport triggers mutant effects. Mutants also have a fusion spell that works with monsters from the main deck and grave if your opponent activates a monster effect or tries to hand trap you. Mutants have a boss fusion monster that's an Omni Negate that recurs in the 3 cards. Now, mutants do have some issues. They're not overly consistent, and despite having a lot of fixes against hand traps, they're still not as great as playing through them. Here's my list for mutants. I was able to fit 9 hand traps. Do know that this is including Dimensional Shifter and Cypherate Gamma, who are very strong. Lastly, I want to mention the card Psi Impulse. It's not breaking the deck, but I feel like more mutant builds should run it. TG, which is short for Touching Genitals, is a synchro spam deck. It used to be fairly dated. With all the new support it's received, it's become fairly competent. Its big play is its Link 3 monster, which summons 3 TG monsters, 1 from hand, 1 from graveyard, and 1 from deck. Luckily, Crystron Hulky Fibrax give access to this card off of any synchro combo starter. Also, the Leak 3 gives targeting protection to your boss monsters. Once you get started, TG have a variety of options, from setting up for making a Baron Nefleur on your opponent's turn, or making their big monster TG Halberd Kin, who's a summon negate. They just have plays. Also, the Assault Mode engine, which isn't great on its own, works amazingly here because not only is it a free Hulk, or free synchro monster, Halberd Cannon also has an assault mode form, letting the assault mode activate actually do some funny stuff. Here's a deck list I found that shows off the combo potential very well. I don't agree with all of its ratios, but it's still very solid. Ursartic are a synchro deck for people who are bad at addition. Ursartic have a unique gimmick of synchro summoning by subtracting levels. Luckily, they have enough extenders to play through hand traps, because this deck lets you special summon out its main deck monsters by attributing level 7 higher monsters from your hand. And thanks to the spell and trap lineup, this deck contributes for less cost. Ursartics have a fantastic spell lineup, letting us do everything from drawing 7 to searching 2, to even stealing an opponent's monster. This deck has a very solid boss monster, an Ursartic Septentrion, who negates the effects of Link and XYZ monsters. What hurts this deck from higher tiers is the lack of a better inboard and how large the engine is. This hurts how many hand traps the deck can run. Good news though, they can run the adventure engine. Incantations do so much to hold up the entire mechanic of ritual summoning, and they are by far the best engine for ritual monsters. They provide free searching, free recursion, and free removal for ritual decks. All you gotta do is reveal a ritual monster or ritual spell in hand, and boom, you got a field full of tributes and a free search. The only downside to this engine is that they can lock you out of the extra deck when they're on field, but for most ritual decks, that's not gonna be a big problem. I would rate incantations higher, but as a deck, they don't do a lot of their own and just have to piggyback off of another. Here's my list for Incantation Necros. I actually have a deck product for this variant for Master Duel where I've used the Incantation monsters for free tribute summons to summon Zaborg the Mega Monarch. Dynamist are a good stuff water machine pendulum deck. What Dynamist have that makes them special is they are a machine water type deck. This means they have access to both Cyber Dragon Infinity and Bahamut Shark. Also, there's access to Aurora on Hulk combos for synchro plays. More specifically on what Dynamists do, the Dynamist machine monsters in Pendulum Scale give each other protection, and their monster effects range from special summoning themselves to less good battle effects. A Dynamist continuous spell says that when a Dynamist card is added from the extra deck to the field, you can add it to the hand. Also, this continuous spell searches one Dynamist card from deck, so it's really good. Here's a list I found for Dynamist. Basically, every Dynamist monster gets run at 3 because there aren't a lot of them, which is a shame because it's an archetype that just has a lot of potential. Thunder Dragon are a banished synergy fusion deck that have unfortunately been in a very bad spot without Colossus, their boss monster. They have the same banished synergy and searching, but without their solid end goal. The only thing keeping it going is how effectively the deck blends with other strategies, from chaos to branded. Thunder monsters get searches from being banished and use generic core like a Lupine to find their fusion spell. What Thunder Dragons make with their fusion spell now is just a quick pop 1 or 2. Here's a list for Thunder Dragons that combines it with branded support. This list is more showing how free branded is as opposed to the strength of Thunder Dragons, but it's a solid deck anyway. Orcus are a graveyard combo deck that had its version of Graph Band, but the crazy stuff Orcus used to do is still somewhat there. Orcus can still set up strong inboards. Orcus have the gimmick of having a field spell that makes all their effects activate as quick effects on the opponent's turn. Gears to the Orcus Mech Knight is a fantastic starter for the deck, and the deck makes great use of the Phoenix Enforcer engine, and most importantly, Orcus can run a lot of hand traps. Just don't expect the deck to be as nearly resilient and explosive as it once was. Final Countdown is a Mystic Mine and Crooked Cook build that just decided to add 10 to 12 painful turns to the stall win con. Unluckily for everyone, Final Countdown has just enough differences to get it its own spot on the tier list away from Mystic Mine. You see, Final Countdown can run both Mystic Mine and Crooked Cook. Now, even though in game it's gonna feel like nothing's happening, there is a difference, and here's a list to prove that. Like, you just wait for your opponent to finally remove Crooked Cook and you go boom, Mystic Mine. If Mystic Mine players are eating Super Glue and Exodia players are eating Elmer's Glue, Final Countdown players are eating Tacky Glue. Evil Heroes, in my opinion, are one of the lower variants of the hero playstyle. If we're committing entirely to the goal of making Evil Hero cards, it's just a bit subpar outside of the generic hero plays. Of course, generic hero plays are still going to be very strong in evil heroes. Now, what specifically separates an evil hero deck from a hero mush or another specific variant is the use of Dark Fusion and the use of evil hero main deck monsters to access cards like evil hero Malicious Bane. Evil heroes have access to graveyard recursion and some searching. Luckily, this deck is pretty consistent, but it's not as good as some other elemental hero lists. Here's a list I found that shows off how evil heroes can work with other hero support. This grants easy access to Darklaw and Destroy Phoenix Enforcer, making it a significantly higher deck in tier 5. Lightsworns are the classic mill deck that has taken a variety of forms over the years. They've been run pure, with zombies and 60-card mush lists, and other rank 8 deck. Thanks to the Chaos Engine cards, like Chaos Space and Chaos Creator, Lightsworns get new life with new ways to turbo summon monsters. What really makes this deck function is Chaos Ruler, the Chaotic Demonic Dragon, who is a level 8 synchro monster who mills 5 and adds 1 of the cards milled to hand. Milling 3 cards is powerful in Lightsworn, so Chaos Ruler's effect is crazy. Also, Chaos Ruler revives himself from grave. This deck has crazy combo potential, and it can play through hand traps pretty decently. It is relatively bricky, but less so than a lot of the low decks on the list. Here's my list. It's not an optimized list. This is a Judgment Dragon Turbo list. It's my favorite way to play the deck, and you can't stop me. But I will brick, but sometimes I'll make 3 JD. World Chalice are a Link Wombo combo deck that revolves around using normals monsters. It's notorious for using the Agent of Creation Venus and Mystic Mind Shine Ball to easily make Link 4s and start its combo. The deck's Link monsters summon normal monsters from hand and graveyard. It's a solid deck, but due to how a lot of the best Link monsters can't use non-effect monsters, it can be a bit janky. Luckily, making an inboard of Apollosa and IP Masquerena, along with other stuff, is pretty easy and consistent. Now, this sounds pretty good, right? What makes it not rogue then? Well, it's the size of the engine and its vulnerability to hand traps that keeps it from being higher. This deck usually also has to commit a lot of hand for combos, and it can't make it back until it gets to Ningirsu. Here's a standard list I found. Small World is an excellent consistency booster. Fossil on OTK Rock deck that have a lot of synergy with more generic rock strategies like Adamancipator. Their central fusion spell, Fossil Fusion, lets use material from either grave to make fusion monsters. They have access to a Rock Foolish Burial that can also draw one. Also, their extra deck monsters can get value in grave. The biggest downside to fossils is their inability to play going first, as well as the spell card Fossil Fusion being unsearchable. This deck gets fixed with the next wave of OCG support comes out, but for now it's a bit rough. Here's my list for Fossil. It's a go second list, although it's quite capable of going first. FA are a level-based Wombo combo deck that gets value for swapping out field spells. Typically, this deck is built by finding the easiest to abuse generic combo and sticking to that. Once upon a time, that was Ancient Fairy Dragon. Today, it's Mecha Phantom Beast Auroradon and Destiny Hero Phoenix Enforcer. But outside of being able to set that up, what can FAs do? Well, they can set up their own spell and trap negate and a Macrocosmos on legs. But really, what they do is abuse generic synchro monsters like Baron the Floor and Borreload Dragon. Also, the FA field spells grant in-archetype monsters some protection and recursion. Here's a list I found that shows off the deck pretty well, but it's an extremely tight engine thanks to how easily field spells can search monsters. FAs can fit in around 10 plus hand traps, all things considered. Da-da-dee are an anime Wombo combo deck. They were released pre-hand trap and it shows for a lot of their older combos. Luckily, this is an anime deck and it's gotten a lot of support over the years. It can make some solid boards through hand traps. The Link 2 is a straight up scale 2 from the deck, and DD Griffin and DD Swirl Slime become excellent extenders or follow-ups through a hand trap. This deck's inboard can include a spell negate, multiple monster steals, a summon Omni negate, and sometimes a Baron de Fleur. Point is, you have options and most of them are pretty good. Small World and Piri Ree's map give the deck a much needed consistency boost, letting it solve its consistency problems. And the deck can fit 9 plus hand traps. Here's a list I found that's pretty solid. Although I wouldn't worry because like all anime decks, it's gonna get support every other year, at least. Sacred I wrote Sacred Press. Sacred Beast are a big boy turbo deck that have a bunch of 1 and 2 card combos. Make a massive 4K beatstick Sacred Beast monsters. Fallen Paradise lets this deck pull off the deck's combos with a clean draw too. Also, it's searchable. Sacred Beast are a tight engine where each card gets another card, letting the deck be super resilient and very small. To prove how incredibly light the Sacred Beast strategy is, here's my list, where I throw in the whole branded strategy and 9 hand traps because I can. Piri map is a fantastic card for consistency. This is a really strong deck, and if it weren't for the consistency issues, and if it was a bit more resistant to hand traps, it would definitely be rogue. Exo Sisters are an anti-graveyard deck that truly excels at destroying graveyard decks, but it really does struggle if the opponent is doing anything else. Exo Sisters can play around hand traps very well, they can set up some solid disruption, but it's definitely a bit janky to work with, even if it is consistent to do so. The engine is very small, so it can run a lot of outside engines or hand traps. Here's my build of Exo Sisters. The biggest problem with this deck right now is how few main deck monsters there are, so you have to run 3 of each. Once this deck gets its 3 cards of OCG support, this deck can very easily become rogue. To give you some context for how much we've improved from where we came from, Battling Boxers have a main deck 3 of card that has less than the first effect of an Exosister card. Exosister Ellis says, if you control an Exosister monster, you can special summon this card from your hand. Then if you control Exosister Stella, you can gain 800 life points. And it has more after that. Versus Battling Boxer Sparer, that if you control a Battling Boxer monster, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, you cannot conduct your battle phase for the rest of this turn. And Ellis still has an extra effect and better XYZ monster options. Decks past here are going to start to get very good. Cubics are a weird monster spam graveyard combo deck that have a lot of synergy with other strategies that send spells and traps to the graveyard. Let me explain the main gimmick of Cubic build so we're all clue. Duza the Meteoric Cubic Vessel sends a Cubic spell or trap from deck to grave, and Unification of the Cubic Lord banishes itself to summon a Cubic monster from deck when a Cubic monster leaves the field. Neither of these are once per turn, meaning Cubics have easy access to climb into a Link 4. Also, all of the Cubic other spells and traps have graveyard effects that are just solid. They also have some anime gimmicky ones if you like memeing your opponent by summoning out 3 bricks directly from the deck if you're losing. Cubics also have a lot of synergy with meta engines, but they don't have the most room for hand traps in their builds. Here's my take on the classic Cubic Eldritch build. Also, the Cubic mechanic of Cubic counters is surprisingly solid, even if it is rarely used. They negate the effect of monsters they're placed on. Here's another 2 decks that are severely intertwined. Paleozoic and Frogs. Paleozoic are a trap monster deck that's all about summoning trap monsters from the grave and making rank 2 water monsters. Especially totally awesome. Unfortunately, this deck is hard go first, and it's not aged the best. It's still got all the solid interruption it used to have back when it first came out, but it needs some updated traps. Because not all of the Paleozoic traps have been created equally, and while you do have access to a Banish, a Book of Moon, a Spell and Trap Pop, it's just not a lot of good Paleozoic traps to run in a build. If you could guarantee you went first with the strategy, it could be Rogue, but you can't do that in Yu-Gi-Oh! Frogs are the other half to Paleozoic. They special summon themselves, get value from grave, and make totally awesome. It's really simple. They work with any water deck. The biggest downside of the Frogs is that there's really only 3 good main deck monsters: Dupe Frog, Swap Frog, and Ronin Tonin. There was a solid Paleo Frog list for Master Duel. Just swap the hand traps for use in the TCG, and the deck's really not going to change a lot. Also, I had originally considered DES as Frogs, and I've just ignored them. But since I've gotten a quest to cover them, they would end up in tier 2 because they work surprisingly enough with actual Frog cards. Supreme King Pendulums, or Magician Pendulums, have seen better days. What once used to be a crazy deck able to abuse Astrograph Sorcerer and Heavy Metal Foes Electromite is now stuck relying on the more easily hand-trappable and less powerful Pendulum support to get the job done. They'll still able to use Time Pendulum graph combos and abuse the generic extra deck. It's just a lot slow and a lot less inconsistent than they used to be. ZR-specific builds are a bit of a meme, but a more focused Pendulum Magician list is still up to speed. Here's a clean list I found that showcases what this deck still has access to. Alright, that's it for part 3. We've covered 69 decks today. The complexity of these decks have gone up dramatically, but I'm getting excited to head up into the Rogue tiers. It's going to be a lot less of me building every deck, and a lot more of me using tournament decks to show y'all how it works. If y'all been enjoying this series so far, go ahead and subscribe. I've got at least 2 more parts to go, and I know you guys don't want to miss it. Also, come join my Discord server if you're interested in talking about card games. I post a lot of my fun deck lists there first, so you gotta enjoy that. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.